Welcome to Cybersecurity Where You Are, the Center for Internet Security's podcast. I'm Sean Atkinson, CISO at CIS.
And I'm Tony Sager, Senior Vice President and Chief Evangelist at CIS. Cybersecurity affects us all, whether we're online at home, managing a company, supporting clients, or running a state or local government.
So join us on Wednesdays as we discuss trends and threats, explore security best practices, and interview experts in the industry.
Together, we'll clarify these issues, creating confidence in the connected world.
Hello and welcome to the show, Cybersecurity Where You Are. I'm Sean Atkinson, CISO here at the Center for Internet Security. One of the things I want to talk about today is AI. AI and specifically privacy. So we're thinking about privacy, its implications, and also the distribution and management of AI technologies today. How are those two either melding together quite nicely, or there's certain conditions and controls we need to be thinking about? Now, obviously, because I'm talking about it, there's controls, right? Necessarily, we've got to think about this from a risk-based perspective. So we think of AI, and one of the things, I'm trying to do in my own vernacular and trying to, provide the community necessarily is AI is a very widespread capability, technology. So there's definitions of certain AI capability that I think we want to get to a little bit of precision. Now, I've mentioned this before, but, I just like to reiterate as we go through. So in this episode, I want to talk about some of the privacy risks, maybe a couple case studies in here to address some of the thoughts in the space, and really looking at how we assess privacy risk within the implementation and utility of AI, both personally and in a corporate environment. So as we go through, one of the things I'm going to recommend, and, I would like to necessarily get your feedback. Okay, so podcast at cisecurity.org to help either clarify certain topics. Again, I'm entering this from a particular lens. We'll talk about biases, but maybe I'm thinking about certain concepts in the space from a particular bias in terms of risk, privacy, and a cybersecurity perspective. We want to look at utility, development, integration of AI capability into certain products and services that are going to be very, very useful. I think we need elements of due diligence as well. So there's also ethical implications, utility of certain training. We've seen, and again, we'll go into some of the use cases, Clearview AI, some of these other respective elements that, we want to look at a disposition. How does ethically we can apply certain capability in the space, and also how that impacts privacy. So anyway, we'll move into the respective topics. Now, when I'm thinking of listing certain criteria and looking at privacy risk in AI systems, what am I thinking about in that sense necessarily? Well, I've got to contextualize the underlying AI. As I've mentioned, a lot of different technologies that are covered under the moniker, as it were, of AI. So we want to think about data minimization. What am I trying to collect and how am I going to use it? In certain respects, how am I necessarily divulging that transparency in this process to the underlying user? That we're collecting this data and we're going to utilize it as part of either a training model, as part of the development or an assessment of a respective model in the space. And model may get us into some of the machine learning aspects or some of the large language model aspects of AI. Perfectly fine. But it still needs to be asked, and we still also need to be necessarily transparent with how we're utilizing that data and necessarily how much of that data is actually necessary for the AI to function. Very, very important. We then move on to some parenthetics. Now, underneath that, I think as we're starting to look at some of these data criteria, and a lot I'm pulling from the GDPR. In terms of some of the respective controls, especially when we think privacy. In some cases, we've started to see worldwide privacy regulation legislation enacted in terms of protecting certain aspects of personal data or personally identifiable information. So in that space, I want to abstract to a privacy impact assessment. Why? Well, I think we need to understand the consumption model of the AI program, product, or service. How or what is needed in order to necessarily allow it to function or build a capability. So we want to think about that collection methodology, both its processing, how it's stored, then ultimately is it shared. In some cases, we have to think about ownership. Who respectfully owns that data when it's collected? Is that being transparent in terms of terms and conditions? You sign up for this particular service, and here's a consequence of that. Here's what necessarily rights you're agreeing to for that data to be used. Now, when we start to look at these particular aspects, we get into a concept of AI governance. And in some cases, does that affect the velocity of our implementation of AI capability when everybody wants to run fast, right? We're running towards AI, and I'll use AI generally again as a term, but we're running to it and necessarily should be walking to it. Should we necessarily put our context lenses in order to see what we're running toward? And we need to be aware of all of the underlying ethical, legal implications, privacy implication, as a parenthetic of legal, and security perspective. Again, those I'm going to lead towards those biases as an assessment strategy. And ultimately, does that enhance a capability to make sure that we've got protective control? Or do we need to be ultimately cutting edge, disregard certain concepts or elements in that space? And just move into AI and deal with the consequences. Again, I'm a little bit more risk averse, but I do want to then say that if we're going to look at these risks, how are we going to quantify them? How are we going to communicate those risks to an organization necessarily that wants to enhance, utilize, consume, and integrate AI capability within business processes? So we want to, necessarily have in our own practice from an AI governance perspective, transparency. But it also leads us as to, so let's say we quantify the risk. We've done an impact assessment, and here are certain controls or structures that we want to use to move forward with such capability. Okay, good. Allows us to move forward. Again, we don't want information security or legal or others to be the departments of no. We want to be the departments of yes, but. And that but necessarily is controls, is looking at governance, looking at a control strategy, looking at an implementation plan, an assessment criteria, third-party supply chain security elements, because in a lot of cases, when I've necessarily assessed or seen how AI is being integrated into what we'll call standard product, it may be a third party that's providing that AI overlay or that AI service, and ultimately, there may not be necessarily the overall due diligence from a supply chain risk perspective that is brought to that integration, because we all need to move to AI. I'll say this, and again, podcasts atcisecurity.org, if any issues or concerns with what I'm saying. I want to have discussions about this because I think it's important for our community. And so we can utilize, the governance, AI Governance Center from the IAPP, and their trainings and some of the learnings coming out from the EU AI Act and the NIST AI RMF and the playbook in that area. I'll go into I think that deserves another podcast. I want to look at governance in that space. But I want to understand and get different ideas in terms of what we need to do in this space in order to be an enabler, but done in a way that's judicious, and we've shown due diligence. Ultimately. Up until recently, threat activity fell into one of three domains: cyber, physical, or information operations.
This made it simpler for defenders to learn about a threat actor, track its evolution, and put protective measures in place.
Unfortunately, it's no longer that simple. Threats are now multidimensional, blending these three domains together.
You can't analyze threats in silos any longer, and a pair of 3D glasses won't help you expose them. You need to see the entire threat environment. You need ThreatWire.
Unlike separate raw data feeds, ThreatWire provides warning and analysis of multidimensional threats all in one place. That means time and money back to make better risk decisions.
ThreatWire isn't just a subscription. It's an exclusive intelligence sharing network that uses its expertise to help you defend against today's multidimensional threats.
Actionable intelligence in a complex world. ThreatWise got your back.
Learn more by visiting cisecurity.org/threatwa.
Now, when we look at privacy assessment with AI, this is going to follow similar practices that we've utilized for GDPR and our own internal privacy program, right? The concept of a data flow should not be new just because AI has been introduced into a certain capability. We should have data flow to know how we're consuming, processing, and outputting certain elements of privacy, personal data, privacy elements within our organization. Very, very important because we need the same controls. So when we think of, data in transit, data in use, data at rest, things that, common elements of any information security program, is we have to think, again, it's the same element of control that we want in play. We then want to have an ability to scrutinize or assess at least those third parties. Right. Now, whether that's through algorithmic impact assessments, whether that's through third-party questionnaire focusing on security, data, AI capability, ethical principles that are being followed with the judicious use of data, that's all part and parcel relatively of that risk quantification. Because in some cases, you're going to have organizations that are risk averse, necessarily want to have a set of controls, or those that maybe have limitations in that space and want to move forward as quickly as possible. Because there is a market element that needs to be captured in this space. It's an opportunity. It's in some cases, it's transformational, such as the information age. We're moving into the AI-enabled age in a lot of cases. And so ultimately, those people, companies, organizations want to be on that edge so that they can ultimately have, the biggest impact, but also receive the biggest impact, the biggest input, market share, growth, whatever that happens to be, whatever the underlying motivation. But it has to be done, I think, with the certain criteria in play. I don't think it's the blinders should be on, and it's just directly towards that organizational goal without thinking about other stakeholders in that space. A topic, and again, this gets into intellectual property and things of that nature, is algorithmic transparency. Do we get to see how necessarily the input, the capability, the AI model as built, does it become an opaque box, which ultimately protects certain criteria, or is there transparency in the space in order to see how necessarily decision is made through these processes? And in some cases, when we look at AI models, neural networks, things of that nature, it may be very difficult to be transparent in that space because there's certain criteria, certain underlying algorithmic or mathematical applications that necessarily don't allow for transparency in that area too. But we can ask the question, and ultimately, what we receive back may be a determining factor in approving or moving forward with an AI governance structure of risk assessment and control. Ultimately, we want to enable, and we shouldn't just be necessarily missing the context as well of certain criteria. There are different applications of AI, and especially when it comes to privacy in terms of data utility. There are some that potentially have no interest or utility of PII or personal data. Do those go through a different tracking? Are they less of a risk? I think it depends. But really here, and again, obviously the topic of this respective podcast is thinking about the privacy implications. Now, one of the things we do at CIS is follow the ISO 27701 standard, right? Privacy Information Management System integrated with ISMS. That helps necessarily build responsibility from both a processor and a controller perspective. Again, go into some of the adages from the GDPR requirements. Gets us thinking about these things and answering very important questions. We could also use the NIST privacy framework, integrated with the NIST AI risk management framework and the risk management playbook. Ultimately, again, the motivation and our scope have to change based on necessarily the data and where it's collected from. That data sovereignty necessarily has connotation on terms of what we need to comply with and what we need to build as part of these privacy protection structures or governance capability. So we move in that space and we want to necessarily have this assessment. That, Sean, respectfully, that is a lot of work that we're trying to do just to move innovation. Our velocity is going to be impacted by thinking about these things. But necessarily, I think it has to be done from a risk perspective. It's not done from a place of trying to diminish velocity or movement into this area, just done that it's more judicious. And again, it's a common term that we're going to bring up is this due diligence. Ultimately, I'm seeing organizations starting to build due diligence programs. And again, those have varying effects and various life cycles necessarily in terms of how they're assessing certain implications of both privacy, data utility, AI model development, and AI distribution of product and service. And, we're kind of feeling our way through this in some cases. We're trying to utilize best practice. We're looking at safeguarding capability and how we then build certain aspects of that into our respective program. So if we want to use, elements of encryption, right, as part of the process, fantastic. Those are common elements that should be part of any underlying security program. Can those be reused? Can we look at anonymization as part of the program, part of the process? Is PII necessarily required all the way throughout this life cycle, or as an ingestion phase, necessarily modified, anonymized, tokenized, whatever the whatever technique that you want to use in that space, and then consumed as part of a model, and necessarily we managing and controlling that in that space. It gets to a term. It's federated learning in terms of we've got a decentralized data source. We don't have to share necessarily the raw data in the space, and allows us then to be a consumer of that ultimately the decentralized capability in that space. So we get what we need in order to be effective, but necessarily we don't need the entire data set, right? We can get to a minimized approach of ingestion, ultimately allowing us to move in a direction that helps us with that velocity, helps cut down necessarily on an exposure in that space, doing it in such a way that I hope that there are stakeholder agreements, right? I think there's, in some cases, and again, I'm going to be, let me go down a little path here, and again, would love to get your thoughts. But in some cases, when you're going through such types of velocity and you're introducing concepts such as agility and lean and things of that nature, is when we want to introduce capability, necessarily the distribution of that information to all stakeholders may not be as transparent as we want it to be. It may be, we're doing proof of concepts that necessarily are not integrating certain practices, whether they're privacy, security, risk-based, oversight, governance strategies, things of that nature, and that we move forward in that area. And ultimately, we come to a design. It's the next greatest thing. It's going to be so profitable, revolutionary in some cases. And we necessarily move through that production or that software development lifecycle a lot quicker, and without necessarily certain checks and bounds. Now, doing that obviously has connotation to certain controls that we want to establish. And I think a strong security, cybersecurity, necessarily security, data management posture within an organization helps contribute to the fact that those stakeholders should be included often and early. So in some cases, let's shift left that responsibility and transparency so that ultimately when we move through a software development lifecycle, a distribution, a continuous deployment type strategy, continuous delivery, a lot of terms in the modern software development space, is that we're doing it in such a way that has consumed different thoughts and ideas from different groups. Because if we miss certain controls, we may be affected by the global regulatory landscape. GDPR, CCPA, Canadian privacy, South African, Singaporean. There are a lot of different privacy regulation that we need to consume, even from a state's perspective, when we've seen the velocity in terms of certain states with individual state-based criteria, again, depending on volume and utility of respective residents of that state, is that has an effect. And if we're not thinking about that or not consuming that type of information to guide our approach, we're doing ourselves a disservice. Because ultimately, in some cases, I think it becomes kind of a twofold responsibility. Awareness internally, and then also kind of a literacy element. And I've used this a couple of times. One of the things I've been saying is I think boards now or governing elements of respective organizations and institutions should be literate in certain elements of security, data management, privacy, risk, as it affects the electronic landscape. I mean, we're moved to a digitized society. I think it's also the responsibility of certain individuals to educate in order to be practiced in certain criteria that are going to be needed when we talk about different risks from an organization perspective, or ultimately control structures and governance. Those are all part and parcel, I feel. And again, I may be biased. There may be certain industry, certain constructs that don't require at least a base level literacy of certain concepts in the space. But I think in some cases it's just due diligence. In educating both ourselves. Now, in some cases that may be something required of legal, infosec, risk management groups, privacy, DPOs, and things of that nature that are having then to do the training to bring necessarily the awareness and literacy up to a level that we can have more thorough and transparent communications about what we're trying to do with respect to data, ownership, management, control, and governance. So when we think about this as well, we also have to address that this is beyond just a corporate construct. There's individual privacy. We're utilizing and managing certain products and services every day. With my students in classes, I always ask, who's ever read the end user license agreement? Or are we just click happy, we click accept, and we move on? What are we giving up in those spaces? And again, it's not for the faint of heart to try and read or consume end user license agreements, especially with the amount of certain products and services that we consume as part of our everyday digitized lives necessarily. Very difficult to get through those terms of service and EULAs all necessarily at a velocity that allows you to access the utility of certain products and tools. So anyway, but we go down this route because we have to obviously have our own sense of ownership of respective data. Different countries see it differently, right? Obviously, GDPR set a tone of any personal data is necessarily the individual's ownership, not that it's been shared and now becomes part of a corporate data set. So that has connotation, and that needs necessarily to be integrated and part of these programs. And so we want to, be careful about what we're necessarily utilizing, what we're agreeing to, and understanding how necessarily that data can be consumed. I want to go into just a use case, and this is very, very recent, but DeepSeek R1 just been released necessarily, and looking at where the data is managed and representatively part of the user agreement, part of the use of the respective tool is looking necessarily at certain metadata, certain privacy elements, certain utility of the underlying product in terms of what is entered, how is that managed, controlled, and necessarily utilized by government entities, potentially by the corporate, the organization itself in terms of releasing a certain product. And then we'll see in that case where now that we've got to a price point that is digestible, it's not talking about billions necessarily, now millions in terms of implementation. Is this kind of the gold rush to utilize a particular model that may be cheaper, more effective, greater competition? Again, it's had financial implications with just the announcement of this capability. And so we've got to think about that. But what necessarily and how are we going to utilize a product? How are we going to manage a governance structure? If we do want to integrate such a capability, we need to know all the factors that go into necessarily the consumable element of that respective product. So we look at risk assessment, right? We want to use frameworks that are not necessarily specifically focused, but have wider aspects so that we then ourselves don't become biased in terms of what we're looking at with respect to an assessment strategy. If we can do that in such a way that requires not just an individual, but maybe others on different teams to be part of the assessment, gives you different perspectives, right? And you want to have kind of this distributed knowledge necessarily, or at least awareness of what's being reviewed so that you get different aspects, right? So you need developer input into this. You need kind of a overall engineering product management perspective. You need a legal infosec risk assessment and get those part of the strategy because necessarily without it, you don't want to leave certain stones unturned. The other piece to that as well that I think is quite important is let's say you have a meeting representatively. You bring people in and ultimately you go through an assessment strategy. I think that's good. I mean, you've got people together, but I think a robust written kind of, yeah, I don't like checklists, but necessarily you do want to have certain criteria identified because, necessarily, and I'll take myself for example, you bring me into a meeting and say, we need to know all the privacy risks with respect to this product because we're moving forward with it, kind of immediately after this meeting is, I may not have that all in my head necessarily. And then you'll say, well, why don't you use an AI agent and have that printed out for you? We can talk about AI-enabled governance capabilities in another episode. But I think we need the framework created, ready, available, contextualized potentially based on the risk assessment. And then we can do a more judicious assessment because it shouldn't be necessarily at that point in time with what I remember and then ultimately through change control come back and say, oh, well, we forgot this whole criteria of that we need, cloud security controls, a FedRAMP compliance potentially, or a StateRAMP compliance. Any of these particular frameworks may be missed. That has huge connotations on how we necessarily can build and execute certain criteria, but you're not going to know that necessarily unless you have the right people at the table and necessarily the right information to make these types of decisions that can be shared. I mean, create the transparency. It's going to help. And then finally, we have just what I'm going to call a call to action. So there's certain use cases in this space. You'll see elements of the Electronic Frontier Foundation working necessarily, sending messaging to new federal government representatives in terms of what we should be doing to move consumer privacy forward, the utility of AI, management oversight, and also advisors about how that can be used and what we build over time. And we've seen massive investment in the AI space to remain a leader in this area. Obviously, we've seen foreign competition in the space that has connotation as well, and that we need to manage this. This is a very, very dynamic space. And we thought necessarily that, we moved to digitized, capability, internet-enabled functionality. Now adding on top of that AI generative capability, the velocity of change and innovation, I feel is going to be enhanced. So we need to be agile in our thinking and our approaches. If we're going to keep up with the pace of innovation, but two, we want to stay ahead with these checklists, these frameworks, this ability to assess what is the risk and what necessarily we taking on by utilizing such a capability in this area. So it's all, there's many, many different perspectives in this space, a lot of expertise, a lot from academia, a lot from corporate, a lot from governmental institutions that are contributing to these areas. But it is, again, fast-paced. We talk about cybersecurity being fast-paced with vulnerability identification, patching, new utility, new capability, tooling, things of that nature. And then we look in the data space, right? The information age and everything that's consumable as part of that. Now you add the AI-enabled space. This is only going to grow faster. And we need to be, on pace, continuing our own innovation, our own learning, our own awareness. And again, you'll be asked questions that I think we're going to have to say, I need to research that before we can necessarily make a decision. Just with the pace of new capability in AI, agentic approaches to AI utility, and very small and necessarily consumable models and elements of utility in that space for specific purpose and function, rather than this, not general AI, but generalized AI models that can answer many different questions, and maybe very specific focus models that are working on certain subject matter that has, particular expertise in a certain space. So we look at all of this. Again, I think there's a lot more commentary that we need to have, and a lot more awareness in terms of privacy and utility that we need to use and think about. So we're looking at how AI systems consume representative data, data minimization, data utility, how it's being used, retained, managed, controlled, ultimately an overarching governance structure. And do we have clear mechanisms in this space? One is a communication vehicle internally, another externally, in order that the buyer beware necessarily, but buyers should be aware of the information that they have and necessarily what they're providing in this space. We'll leave it there. Again, thank you so much for listening to the episode. Again, podcast at cisecurity.org if we want to continue this conversation. If you have thoughts, at the CI Security on YouTube. And with that, we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the podcast today.
The thoughts and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are solely theirs and do not necessarily reflect those of CIS.
Tune in on Wednesdays for a new episode. And in the meantime, visit our website at cisecurity.org.
Together, we'll continue our efforts of creating confidence in the connected world.